The Bliss farm was a 60-acre tract of land that had the unfortunate fate of being located midway between the Union and Confederate armies, occupying their respective ridge lines during the second and third days of fighting at Gettysburg. Beginning on the morning of July 2nd, skirmishers and sharpshooters from both sides exchanged occupancy of the large two-story barn and adjacent two-story farmhouse. When the rebels were in control, sharpshooters used the second floor of each building to fire effectively, inflicting numerous casualties on Union infantry lines and artillery batteries 700 yards to the east on Cemetery Ridge. Likewise, when Union forces had possession of the farm, their fire pushed Confederate soldiers back into the Bliss orchard to the west and inflicted casualties on rebel battery targets along Seminary Ridge. This video picks up where Part 1 left off. The farm buildings had changed hands 6 times on July 2nd. Only darkness forced a pause in the struggle, with the Confederates in control of the strategically positioned buildings. As dawn was breaking on July 3rd, Union senior officers found their units still being harassed by the effective rebel sharpshooter fire. Once again, something needed to be done. This video has been extracted from a comprehensive work that encompasses every inch of the Gettysburg battlefield, a highly detailed animation covering over 60 hours of conflict that took place on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. For more information about this acclaimed work and how you can use it to explore the entire battlefield and battle, visit our website, gettysburganimated.com. During the night of July 2nd through the pre-dawn hours of the 3rd, the status quo of the grassy fields between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge remained relatively quiet. Mahone's brigade made a moonlight trek from Seminary Ridge to the fields south of the Bliss farm, but quickly countermarched back from whence they came, but not before leaving about 100 skirmishers to stand vigil. Earlier that evening, when Posey withdrew from the Emmitsburg road, he ordered skirmishers from the 12th Mississippi to reoccupy the Bliss farm buildings when his brigade passed, as it headed back to Seminary Ridge. On the Union front, skirmishers from the 106th Pennsylvania and the 14th Connecticut spent the night behind a fence line about 100 yards from the Emmitsburg road. But as the morning twilight skies brightened, Second Corps skirmishers from no less than 5 regiments moved west down the slope of Cemetery Ridge and across the Emmitsburg road, taking up positions behind fence lines. Opposite them, the rebel skirmishers were 400 to 500 yards distant. Elwood W. Christ, in his book The Struggle for the Bliss Farm at Gettysburg, writes, quote, "The skirmishers of the 14th Connecticut were not the only men on the picket line that morning. Near the Corderi farm buildings, men of Webb's brigade harassed their Confederate counterparts. Also near the Bryan house, the 1st Delaware, supported by other details from Hayes's division, including men from the 125th New York and companies A and C of the 108th New York, plied their trade." Unquote. The companies of the 108th New York, plus 8 companies of the 8th Ohio, had been on the skirmish line northeast of the Bliss farm since the evening before. But as the reinforced Union skirmish line ramped up their firing across the fields, the rebel sharpshooters, from protections afforded by the Bliss farm buildings and groundworks, intensified their fire, focused on Arnold's battery and Smythe's regiments. The intermittent yet constant pop-pop from the muskets of both Confederate and Union skirmishers and sharpshooters continued from just before sunrise through 7 a.m. Lieutenant John Brady of the 1st Delaware, who the day before had played an integral role in a temporary occupancy of the Bliss farm buildings, in a post-war letter to historian John Batchelder, claimed to have received an order from General Hayes to take and hold the barn at all hazards. He recruited a volunteer detachment of 27 men from the 1st Delaware and 4 or 5 additional men from the 12th New Jersey. The small group moved north along the ridge to a staging area behind the Bryan barn, where they divested themselves of all equipment unnecessary for their pending charge. Then they double-quick west under heavy fire. Per Brady's correspondence to Batchelder to, quote, within 50 feet of the barn, were checked by a withering fire from the various barn vents and compelled to retire, unquote. Author Chris writes, quote, of this small band, nearly all were casualties, with 2 killed and approximately 24 wounded, unquote. The ill-conceived and undermanned foray of Brady's band triggered a series of artillery exchanges between the two sides. Years after the battle, 2nd Lieutenant John Egan of Woodruff's battery wrote, quote, batteries opened at intervals from different points along the whole rebel line upon the artillery of the 2nd Corps, 10 or 12 distinct artillery fights, unquote. One of the first artillery duels began when Cushing's battery, in an effort to cover Brady's withdrawal, fired a few rounds at the barn, which, within a few minutes, resulted in the evacuation of the barn by the enemy's sharpshooters. But the Union artillery fire drew counter-battery fire from the Confederates that hit one of Cushing's limbers, its detonation triggering the explosion of 2 others. Within a few minutes after the exchange, the rebels reoccupied the Bliss barn and resumed their sniping at the Federal forces on Cemetery Ridge. The resumption of rebel fire from the Bliss buildings triggered General Hayes to again order that they be retaken. Having attacked and briefly controlled the buildings the afternoon before, the 12th New Jersey was selected once more. Designated for this assignment were 5 different companies, A, C, D, F, and G, this time commanded by Captain Thompson. Supported by Brady and men from the 1st Delaware who had not yet been engaged, Thompson's detachment numbered about 200 men, significantly more than the band of 30 or so that had attempted the mission an hour earlier. After moving behind the Bryan barn, they moved west down the farm lane and across the Emmitsburg Road. Then, using the crest of the broad knoll for cover, they formed into columns by companies and charged the barn. As they rushed forward, they were in plain view of the Confederates firing from in and around the farm buildings, but also unexpectedly enfiladed by fire from Thomas's troops, hidden in the sunken road near Stevens Run. Posey's skirmishers, though, withdrew back into the Bliss orchard in the face of superior Union numbers. Federal soldiers were again in control of the Bliss buildings. This marked the 7th time they had changed hands since the fighting for control of the farm had begun some 24 hours earlier. Regrouping in the Bliss orchard, the rebel skirmishers immediately began reforming a new skirmish line. Supported by effective sharpshooter fire from Thomas's men in the heavy brush surrounding Stevens Run, Posey's men inched closer and closer to the buildings. Still, Thompson reported that he held the buildings, quote, for some time, unquote. But the seriousness of the situation facing the Union detachment was escalated when a Confederate battery on Seminary Ridge began blasting solid shot into the western walls of the barn, the flying stones and mortar making things quite difficult for the 12th New Jersey and 1st Delaware infantrymen. Thompson ordered a withdrawal. Concurrent with the escalating activity focused on the Bliss buildings, the 8th Ohio Skirmish Line, who was positioned to the north-northeast and directly in front of the rebel skirmish line of Thomas's brigade, was suddenly faced with an assault from the west. 100 or so skirmishers from the Georgia regiments, themselves entrenched behind fences bordering Long Lane, began aggressively firing and advancing toward the Union line, less than 100 yards to their front. This movement, supporting the Posey skirmishers, once again assailing the Bliss buildings, was initially met by fire from the 8th Ohio and 108th New York skirmishers, but they received immediate support. The charge of the 8th Ohio Reserve from the Emmitsburg Road down the slope to the Union skirmish line not only had the impact of thwarting the Georgians' advance, but also drew the attention of the rebels lurking in and firing from the bushes along Stevens Run. This diversion was just the opportunity Thompson's threatened force needed. With the Confederates focused on the 8th Ohio, of the 12th New Jersey and 1st Delaware men, author Elwood Christ writes, quote, "Withdrawing under enemy artillery fire, Thompson's men moved by their right flank and fired a volley into the bushes. The double Union threat of Jersey men and Buckeyes and the effects of artillery fire from Cemetery Ridge were too much for the Confederates." Unquote. As the rebels retreated, Thompson's detachment left the defense of the knoll northeast of the Bliss farm in the capable hands of the 8th Ohio, and his force withdrew back across the Emmitsburg Road. With Thompson's withdrawal, the Mississippians reoccupied the barn and farmhouse. This marked the 8th time the Bliss farm had changed hands. After essentially shelling Thompson's unit out of the Bliss barn and farmyard, Confederate artillery redirected their sporadic firing on the ridge. And now it was the rebels' turn to further up the ante. Posey reinforced the skirmish line with a detachment from the 16th Mississippi, and they immediately contributed to the resumption of the peppering of the main Union line. It was this reinforced sharpshooter line in and around the farm buildings that primarily inflicted casualties on the 2nd Corps battery men, more so than the sporadic rebel artillery fire. Author Jeffrey Wirt, in his book Gettysburg Day 3, writes of the sharpshooter fire, quote, "Now the Confederates seemed to direct their shots at Captain Arnold's battery. Arnold soon complained to Colonel Smythe, whose brigade manned the wall in front of the cannon, asking Smythe if he could not burn the barn." Unquote. It was not a new idea. The subject of burning the farm buildings had come up numerous times over the past 24 hours, but now the idea was gaining more credence. Nonetheless, Wirt continues, quote, "General Hayes had decided, meanwhile, to try to retake and hold the buildings one more time. Hayes gave the order to Smythe, who assigned the work to Major Ellis in command of the 14th Connecticut." Unquote. With 2 companies posted out on the skirmish line, the 14th Connecticut had 8 companies, about 130 men, available for the assignment. Ellis directed Captain Moore to take 4 companies, about 60 men, and ready the detachment for the 600-yard dash to the Bliss barn. In his History of the 14th Connecticut, written 28 years after the battle, Chaplain H.S. Stevens pondered, quote, "Why a force of about half as large as either of the other parties previously sent for the same purpose was sent this time is one of the inscrutable things of the varying wisdom of war." Unquote. Author Elwood Christ meticulously postulates the reason for the small force, including the fact that 2 of the 4 assaulting companies had modern breech-loading Sharps rifles. Another is that the timely intelligence about the strength of the recently reinforced Confederate force at the Bliss farm might not have made its way up the chain of command. But Chaplain Stevens conjured that someone, quote, "possibly thought that 1/14th man was equal to any 2, unquote. And so Moore's group went forward, probably unaware of the superior strength of the enemy they were about to take on. As Moore's small force moves first behind the Bryan barn and then begins to double quick down the farm lane, passing by General Hayes, he shouts a verbal order not to charge the barn in any compact formation. Elwood Christ describes the scene, writing, quote, "Upon crossing the roadway, the soldiers were given orders to break, and each man reached the barn as best he could." Unquote. It was wise advice. Author Jeffrey Wirt writes, quote, "The men scattered and ran for the barn. When they reached the knoll, the Confederates from the Bliss barn and house, and from a long lane, raked them. One Connecticut soldier said it was like dodging 10,000 shafts of lightning." Unquote. As the Federals raced wildly for the barn, the abruptness of the attack forced the Confederate soldiers there to beat a hasty retreat into the orchard for the 5th time. The barn was back in control of Union troops, the 9th change of hands. But Moore's small unit became caught in a crossfire, with the Mississippians pouring a withering fire into the barn from the orchard and the house. Meanwhile, back on the ridge, Hayes and Smythe finally realized that Moore was vastly outnumbered and ordered Major Ellis to advance the remaining 4 companies to his aid. Now it was Ellis's turn, and he inexplicably led his 60-man detachment on a more northerly route toward the farm, closer to the severe enfilading fire coming from Thomas's brigade. Historical hindsight reveals that a more southerly route might have been the better choice, given that at least there would be no deadly fire coming from the barn, still controlled by Moore's men. But they succeeded in running the gauntlet, and upon reaching the house, after a brief firefight, drove the rebels out. Within minutes, the struggle intensified once again, as a sizable portion of Confederate artillery on Seminary Ridge opened on both the house and the barn, with solid shot and case shot. Interestingly, Colonel Alexander, who earlier this day had been given tactical control of Longstreet's 1st Corps batteries, watched and grumbled as 3rd Corps batteries continued to waste ammunition. As was the case numerous times since dawn, they continued to drain the supply of long-range munitions that was essential for the upcoming cannonade, attempting to drive off advanced Union skirmishers from an isolated barn and farmhouse. But while wasteful, it was again effective. Of the cannon fire, Wirt writes, quote, "Inside the house, the Federals discovered quickly that the weatherboard could not stop neither artillery rounds nor Minié-balls. Ellis ordered it evacuated." Unquote. But inside the 2nd story of the stone barn, however, the situation was not much better, as shrouds of metal and blasted stone rained down on the Connecticut soldiers. Back on Cemetery Ridge, General Hayes had seen enough. With discretionary orders from General Hancock in hand, authorizing the burning of the farm buildings, Hayes asked Colonel McDonald of the 111th New York to recruit a volunteer to carry an order out to the farm. Sergeant Charles Hitchcock stepped forward, and after being sure he had some matches, off he sprinted, zigzagging his way across the Emmitsburg Road, through the field and fences, to the barn. Once there, to the embattled Ellis in the 14th Connecticut, he transmitted the order from Hayes to burn the house and barn and retire. Ellis had his men gather piles of hay and straw in the barn, and then sent a detail back to the house. There they stacked furniture and bedding. The piles in both buildings were lighted. In Gettysburg Day 3, Jeffrey Wirt described the scene, writing, quote, "A few men lit the piles and joined their comrades. Ellis waited until the smoke and flames would provide some concealment before leading them back to Cemetery Ridge. As they watched the fire engulf both buildings, chickens flew from the barn and were grabbed by the soldiers. Finally, Ellis ordered them away. They did not halt until they reached the Emmitsburg Road." Unquote. There, shielded from small arms fire by the terrain, they began to reorganize. The fires totally consumed both buildings, and with their respective second floors collapsed into the inferno, they ceased to exist as a platform from which the rebel sharpshooters could torment the Union soldiers on Cemetery Ridge. The issue of which army would control the Bliss farm buildings, after changing hands 9 times in about 30 hours, was finally a moot point. The house and barn had been reduced to 2 blazing piles of rubble. As a historical footnote, in the early stages of the Pickett/Pettigrew charge, 1st Pettigrew's brigade, now commanded by Marshall, and then Davis's brigade, followed a few minutes later by Lane's brigade, all had to navigate around the 2 still burning farm buildings directly in their respective paths. Their lines got a bit jumbled up, and they had to halt and redress their ranks once past the fires. They each paused their forward progress on the eastern side of the heated ruins, in the swale of Stevens Run. The significance here is that a number of men from the brigades never left the cover of the brook banks, similar to what would happen again a few minutes later when they would reach the stout fence sections on both sides of the Emmitsburg Road that had survived intact after 24 hours of fighting to that point. The Bliss farm fires impacted the effective line sizes of the brigades of Pettigrew's division that would make it to Cemetery Ridge. Of all of the civilians that had been directly affected by the July 1863 battles, the result of Lee's campaign into Pennsylvania, the Bliss family were the only ones who had lost nearly everything. Forced to quickly flee on July 2nd, with just the clothes on their back and what they could carry, when they returned a few days later, they found only the charred stone walls of the barn and the house completely gone. They relocated back to Chautauqua County, New York, in 1867, having first settled there in 1835. They purchased the farm and moved to Gettysburg in 1857. The family was never compensated for their losses, although numerous claims to an even greater number of government agencies were filed by William Bliss, and after his death, his youngest daughter, Frances. Their last rejection was in December of 1902. Today, the only remaining evidence of the existence of the Bliss farm is a large mound of earth that was once the ramp used to access the second floor of the barn. There are markers commemorating the skirmish positions of the 1st Delaware, 12th New Jersey, and 14th Connecticut. The 12th New Jersey has a marker positioned midway between the former barn and house sites. The 1st Delaware marker is a groundstone at the eastern edge of the former orchard site, representing their advanced skirmish line position. The 14th Connecticut has 2 Bliss farm markers, one depicting the location of the center of the farmhouse, and the second one in front of the earthen ramp.